As we think about sentence style, it can be really useful to have some terminology to describe what we're seeing. And these two terms here, paratacsis and hypotaxis, are especially useful in describing two different styles. First of all, paratacsis comes from Greek, actually both of these words do, and we have this little prefix para, which means beside or near. And then the last part, taxis, taxis comes from Greek as well, and it has to do with arrangement. So arrangement. Now, the idea then with parataxis is that you have sentences, as in the first example, that are arranged paratactically. Okay, so the adjective is paratactic, or paratactically. And in this case, you have sentences that are next to each other, but they're not subordinated. They're not really linked. Each sentence is sort of by itself. And within the sentence as well, and this is really the crucial part, this is what makes it paratactic, within each sentence, the clauses are not subordinated to each other. So they're all kind of on the same level. And we can describe parataxis then as a kind of coordination. In other words, sentences are placed beside each other, but they're not subordinated to each other. Okay, so we have an arrangement of clauses beside each other with no sense of whether one is more important than the other one. Hypotaxis, and we'll look at the examples in more detail in a minute. Hypotaxis also comes from Greek, as mentioned, and hypo means under or beneath. All right, so hypo equals under or beneath. And hypotaxis refers to clauses that are subordinated, so subordination. All right, let's see how this actually works. In our first example then, we read, Sarah loves NBA basketball. Her favorite team is the Golden State Warriors, and she tries to watch every game. So far, we've only seen one conjunction, and that's and. And this kind of conjunction doesn't really say that one thing is more important than another. Right? This is a coordinated conjunction. It just says, well, here's another fact. Sarah's favorite player is Steph Curry. She relates to the fact that he's undersized, and there's another and has to rely on pure skill and talent. Sarah faces challenges too. She is paraplegic. So you can see that all of these sentences, they're all one after the other, but they're not really being subordinated to each other. And if we look at our second example, if we rewrite this, you can now start to see that this becomes more hypotactic. Okay, so the first example is an example of parataxis, and the second example is one for hypotaxis. Now we're starting to use subordinating conjunctions. So we have, although Sarah is paraplegic, she loves watching NBA basketball. And then here we have in fact, connecting a couple of clauses. Then we have because, right? And then we finally have an and as well, which is more paratactic. What's the difference between these two styles? Why might you prefer one over another? Well, first of all, neither of these styles is necessarily the best style. Each one has its uses. For instance, if you read the work of Ernest Hemingway, the great writer, you'll find that he uses a tremendous amount of parataxis, which creates a really interesting stylistic effect. In an academic essay, you often tend to use a lot of hypotaxis because you're trying to link ideas together much more. So what you see then in these kinds of sentences is a difference between, with parataxis, simple sentences and sometimes compound sentences. Okay, so a compound sentence is just one that connects a couple of independent clauses with and, as you can see here, and a simple sentence is a sentence that just has one clause. Hypotaxis consists usually of complex sentences, and these are sentences that have at least one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. And you can see that in the second example. Although Sarah is paraplegic, that's a dependent clause, and it's being linked to this later clause, the independent one. So we can start to see some differences then between the kinds of clauses that are being used here. The result then is also different. With parataxis, we tend to create an effect that has to do more with equality than with hierarchy. Okay, so we're expressing a kind of equality of ideas, whereas with hypotaxis, we're talking about a hierarchy of ideas. Some ideas are more important than others, and we're linking them to each other. We can also refer to the difference here as being between a kind of implicit connection and an overt connection. If you look at the first one here, you know, Sarah loves basketball, she's paraplegic, she admires Steph Curry, but these facts are not being connected to each other. You have to figure out that maybe she admires Steph Curry because he's undersized and she struggles with different things, and that's why, you know, she has this admiration for him. That's much less in doubt in the second one, which is more overt. Okay, so parataxis tends to spell the ideas out much more. It's much more overt. Sorry, hypotaxis spells the ideas out much more. It's more overt, and parataxis is more implicit. And as a result, we can really kind of capture the difference in style by saying that parataxis tends to create an effect that's more choppy and more detached. And that can be an emotional detachment as well. If you read Hemingway again, you know, the effect is often of a journalist, a reporter, just saying, well, here are the facts, boom, 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 boom. Whereas with hypotaxis, there's really a sense in which we are investing ourselves in the facts. We're creating order. We're saying, well, this is important, that's less important. And so we're less emotionally detached, intellectually detached. We're much more kind of trying to arrange all of the material in a form that makes sense to us. So we could say then that hypotaxis is more complex, but that also has a downside. If all your sentences are hypotactic, then it can be much more difficult to read, because the reader has to constantly make sense of the relationship between clauses. And the difference then between parataxis and hypotaxis, if you think about your own style, is that you have to think about your reader. Is your reader going to be happy about having these really complicated sentences all the time? Or would your reader really enjoy having this kind of clarity of parataxis and be able to connect the ideas him or herself? The point then, just to kind of sum up, is that when you think about your style, you don't have to pick parataxis or hypotaxis. What you need to do is really be conscious of the different parts of your essay, let's say, and how you've shaped them using these different stylistic devices. Okay, so you might mix it up. You might have a bit more of a choppy section that moves more quickly. You might have a section that's more subordinated. Whatever you pick, try to use these two stylistic features in a way that's pleasing, that's elegant, and that's effective.